The MG42 didn't sound like gunfire. It sounded like the earth being ripped apart with that distinctive buzzsaw roar that every soldier on the Western Front had learned to fear, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute in bursts so fast you couldn't hear individual shots. And in less than 30 seconds 4 of these German machine guns had pinned 90 American infantrymen to a muddy slope with nowhere to crawl, nowhere to run, and no cover left standing because the interlocking fields of fire from MG42 teams positioned in depth had turned the entire approach into a kill zone where movement meant death and staying still meant dying slowly. And then Staff Sergeant William "Red" Callahan, a veteran machine gunner from Ohio who'd been firing Browning M1919s since North Africa, looked at a pile of sandbags, meant for protection, already shredded by bullets and leaking sand everywhere, and realized he could turn them into a weapon, could use them to lie to the enemy, could exploit the Germans' training and doctrine in ways that might save 90 men who were otherwise going to die in the mud of France in late 1944. What happened next took just 18 minutes and changed the fate of an entire battalion. Though to understand how sandbags became offensive weapons requires understanding the tactical nightmare that American forces faced on that gray November afternoon, when cold rain mixed with smoke and the smell of cordite and churned mud, when the terrain itself seemed designed to funnel troops into a deadly corridor between shattered hedgerows where German defensive positions commanded every approach, where 4 MG42 teams had been positioned with the methodical precision that characterized German defensive doctrine, each gun covering overlapping sectors so that any gap in one team's fire was immediately filled by another, creating a web of interlocking fire lanes that made advance suicidal and retreat impossible because the Germans had ranged their weapons to cover withdrawal routes as thoroughly as approach paths. The MG42 teams fired in careful rotation to prevent overheating, each gun unleashing bursts of 20 to 30 rounds before pausing while another gun took up the fire, creating a rhythm of continuous suppression that kept American soldiers pinned flat against whatever minimal cover they could find. Shallow depressions in the ground, bodies of men killed in earlier assault attempts, the shattered remains of stone walls that provided concealment but not protection from rounds that could punch through brick and still kill whatever was behind it. And supporting these machine guns were German riflemen and spotters who watched for American movement and called adjustments, who ensured that any soldier foolish enough to try advancing was immediately engaged by concentrated fire from multiple weapons. The American situation was desperate in ways that even experienced infantry officers couldn't see a solution for. An entire company, roughly 90 men who'd survived Normandy and the drive across France, found themselves halted mid-advance on terrain they'd been ordered to take, unable to move forward without being cut down, unable to fall back without exposing themselves to fire that was already searching for any sign of retreat, and casualties were mounting every minute as German gunners walked their fire across suspected positions, as mortar rounds began dropping with increasing accuracy suggesting that forward observers were adjusting targeting, and officers who tried to signal movement or coordinate maneuvers became immediate targets because the Germans were watching for exactly those signs of command and control. Staff Sergeant William "Red" Callahan occupied a machine gun position that barely qualified as protected, a shallow depression behind what remained of a hedgerow that had been chewed apart by earlier exchanges. His Browning M1919 set up on its bipod with ammunition belts draped over mud-covered sandbags, his assistant gunner bleeding from a shoulder wound that needed treatment but couldn't be reached because the medic was pinned down 50 yards away, and his radio destroyed by a near miss that had killed the man carrying it and left Callahan isolated from command, operating on his own initiative and tactical understanding developed through 2 years of combat that had taught him to read battlefields the way some men read books. Callahan listened to the MG42 rhythm, counted the bursts and timed the pauses, watched where tracers arced through the rain and noted their impact points, observed how German gunners adjusted fire based on what they saw and heard, and in this careful observation he began to understand not just what the Germans were doing but how they were thinking, what training and doctrine guided their decisions, what visual and auditory cues they relied on to identify targets and assess effectiveness. And this understanding became the foundation for an improvisation that would save 90 lives through psychological manipulation rather than superior firepower. The sandbags scattered around Callahan's position had been meant as protective cover, had been filled and stacked according to field manual specifications to create barriers that would stop rifle rounds and shell fragments, but German fire had shredded many of them, had torn the burlap fabric and spilled sand across the ground in pale streaks that stood out against dark mud, and Callahan noticed something that most soldiers wouldn't have consciously registered. When bullets hit sandbags, sand exploded visibly in small clouds that were clearly visible even at hundreds of meters, creating distinct visual feedback that German gunners used to assess whether their fire was hitting near targets, whether they needed to adjust elevation or traverse, whether suppression was effective, and this visual feedback was automatic, was built into German gunnery training that emphasized observation of impact points and immediate correction of fire based on what those impacts revealed. Callahan realized with sudden clarity that sandbags could lie, could provide false feedback, could make German gunners think they were hitting positions they weren't actually hitting, could draw fire away from real American positions toward dummy positions that existed only to waste German ammunition and attention, and this realization transformed sandbags from defensive equipment into offensive weapons, from passive protection into active deception, and Callahan began formulating a plan that was part physics, part psychology, and entirely dependent on understanding how his enemies had been trained to fight. The sandbag trick, as it would later be called, required precise execution and perfect timing. Callahan began by stacking loose sandbags away from his actual firing position, placing them in locations that suggested good cover, arranging them in patterns that looked like someone had hastily prepared a defensive position, leaving them partially exposed so German observers would notice them and mark them as probable American locations, and then he deliberately kicked sand forward to create disturbed patterns that suggested recent activity, that made it appear someone had been digging in or repositioning, and once these dummy positions were prepared, he used his M1919 to fire controlled bursts that were calculated to provoke German response, short, precise strings of 5 to 7 rounds that were aggressive enough to draw attention but not sustained enough to give away his actual position through prolonged muzzle flash. The German reaction was exactly what Callahan predicted. MG42 teams shifted fire toward the sandbag positions, unleashed devastating bursts that tore through the stacked bags and created massive clouds of sand that confirmed to German gunners that their fire was on target, that they were suppressing American positions effectively, that their doctrine of overwhelming firepower applied to suspected enemy locations was working as designed, and in this confirmation bias, this tendency to interpret ambiguous feedback as supporting existing beliefs, Callahan found his tactical advantage, found the psychological vulnerability he could exploit. While German guns hammered empty sandbag positions, Callahan exploited the distraction by firing short, precise bursts at German muzzle flashes, at the distinctive sparks that marked MG42 positions when they fired, adjusting his elevation by watching where his tracers went, compensating for the ballistic differences between his slower-firing M1919 and the German guns, and most importantly timing his fire for moments when German crews were changing barrels because the MG42's incredible rate of fire meant barrels overheated quickly and had to be swapped out every few hundred rounds, creating brief windows when the gun was inoperable and the crew was focused on maintenance rather than observation. The first MG42 team died without probably understanding what killed them. Callahan's burst caught the assistant gunner as he was lifting a fresh barrel, the man dropping the hot metal and falling backward, and then a second burst found the primary gunner who was reaching for his rifle, and suddenly one of the 4 Germ. The second MG42 team fell for a variation of the trick. Callahan repositioned sandbags while German fire was focused elsewhere, created a new dummy position that suggested Americans were trying to flank, and when the German gunner overcorrected his fire to engage this apparent flanking movement, Callahan used ricochet fire, deliberately bouncing rounds off the stone foundation of a destroyed building, to hit the German position from an unexpected angle, and the combination of misdirection and unconventional fire trajectory caught the crew off guard. And when the gun fell silent a second time, the remaining German teams became more cautious, more disciplined, suggesting that veteran crews were recognizing something unusual was happening even if they couldn't identify exactly what. The third MG42 team tried to adapt, attempted flanking fire themselves, coordinated with riflemen to suppress suspected American positions while the machine gun repositioned, but Callahan anticipated this by using sand spray to fake A. The fourth MG42 team was different, was clearly a veteran crew that had survived months of combat through discipline and tactical awareness, and their fire pattern showed it. Carefully measured bursts rather than sustained fire, constant position changes that made targeting difficult, effective countersuppression that forced Callahan to keep his head down, and coordination with supporting riflemen who engaged any position that fired. And for several minutes Callahan couldn't find an opening, couldn't create an opportunity, nearly got hit when a burst walked across his position and killed his assistant gunner who'd been lying wounded beside him, leaving Callahan alone with his gun and running low on ammunition and facing an enemy crew that clearly understood something was wrong and had adapted their tactics accordingly. The final maneuver required Callahan to take a calculated risk that could easily have gotten him killed. He deliberately dumped sand directly into open ground between his position and the GUR. The silence was overwhelming, was so sudden and complete that for several seconds nobody moved because soldiers who'd been under continuous fire for 20 minutes couldn't immediately process that the firing had stopped, couldn't trust that the absence of bullets meant safety rather than a lull before renewed engagement. But gradually ears stopped ringing and smoke began to drift and men began to realize they were alive, that they could move without being shot, that the kill zone had been transformed from impassable terrain into ground that could be crossed, and American infantry began to rise with the cautious movements of people who still expect to be shot but are willing to risk it. And when no fire came they rose fully and began to advance, and medics who'd been pinned with everyone else moved freely for the first time in an hour, and the German line that had seemed impregnable minutes earlier began to collapse as defending forces realized their machine gun support was gone, and that staying in position meant being overrun. The casualty accounting would come later, but the immediate tactical result was obvious. For MG42 teams destroyed by a single American machine gunner, dozens of German soldiers killed or captured in the subsequent advance, 90 American infantrymen saved from what had seemed like certain death, and a breakthrough achieved that allowed the battalion to resume its advance and accomplish objectives that had seemed unattainable an hour earlier, all because one staff sergeant had looked at sandbags and seen not just protection but potential weapons, had understood his enemy's training and doctrine well enough to exploit it, had possessed the tactical creativity to turn defensive equipment into offensive deception. Callahan refused all praise, deflected credit to his dead assistant gunner and to the infantry who'd advanced after he'd cleared the guns, immediately set about rebuilding his gun team and repositioning for potential counterattack because his experience said that Germans didn't give up ground without attempting to retake it, and while officers wrote after-action reports that mentioned sandbag deception and tactical innovation, Callahan just did what veteran machine gunners always did: maintained his weapon, conserved ammunition, watched his sector, and prepared for the next engagement because wars weren't won in single battles but through sustained application of violence and tactical intelligence across hundreds of such engagements. The legacy of the Sandbag Trick spread through American forces in the way such innovations always spread, through word of mouth, through after-action reports that were read by intelligence officers and training cadre, through the informal networks of veterans who taught new replacements the tricks that kept soldiers alive. And while it never became codified doctrine because it was too situation-dependent and required too much tactical awareness to be taught in training, it entered the repertoire of techniques that experienced machine gunners might employ when conventional tactics weren't working, when enemy positions needed to be neutralized but direct fire wasn't achieving results, when deception and misdirection offered advantages that firepower alone couldn't provide. The sandbags were never meant to fight, were designed and issued as protective equipment, as barriers between soldiers and bullets, as engineering supplies that made defensive positions more survivable, but in the hands of one machine gunner who understood both the physics of his weapon and the psychology of his enemies, they became offensive weapons that saved 90 lives in less than 20 minutes. That proved once again that war doesn't reward strength alone but sometimes rewards the soldier who thinks differently, who sees possibilities others miss, who understands that the enemy's training and doctrine create predictable responses that can be exploited, and who possesses the tactical creativity to turn anything, even sandbags, into tools of victory. And in the final accounting of World War II's countless engagements and innovations, Staff Sergeant William Red Callahan's Sandbag Trick stands as testament to the idea that survival and success in combat often depend less on superior equipment or numbers than on the intelligence to understand how enemies think, the creativity to exploit their assumptions and training, and the courage to execute unconventional tactics that seem crazy until they work and then seem obvious in retrospect, proving that sometimes the difference between a pinned platoon facing annihilation and a successful advance is nothing more than one soldier who looked at a pile of torn sandbags leaking sand into French mud and saw not disaster but opportunity, not the failure of protection but the potential for deception, and who, in 18 minutes of controlled violence, used that insight to destroy 4 of the most feared weapons on the Western Front and save 90 men who went home to their families instead of dying on a rainy November afternoon because one machine gunner understood that in war, the most dangerous weapons are sometimes the ones that make enemies think they're winning when they're actually destroying themselves.